Hi everyone. I thought I'd put this demo together before I start diving into any type of paintings with Corel. The reason why is this is just going to be just suggestions, explanations of how I approach my own photo reference. Now, I only work for my own photos, and this is how it evolved. When I first started painting, I got into photography just to have my own references to paint from. I felt better when I was on location photographing things. I could make mental notes, take different pictures of the same thing so it was well documented, and I just wanted as much information about what I was going to paint as possible. Now, for this reason, though, I have found over the years that cameras and especially the optics of the cameras themselves are very limited and a lot more than you would think or maybe expect. And the reason why is just, for example, when you look at something, your eyes immediately adjust to the distance and the amount of light. Whereas when you take a photograph, it only adjusts to one setting of each, the distance and also the amount of light. So sometimes other things suffer when that happens. Now, we're going to go over some ways that if you get a chance to do your own photography, it might help you to actually benefit your reference that you're working from, no matter what the subject, no matter what you're taking your own photographs of. This demo will actually help you improve your photography, and then also just to watch what you're working from with photo reference. Especially if it's not your own photo reference, then you may want to ask yourself some questions. Now, if it's not critical to you, then it doesn't matter. But if you want to ask yourself questions about what's going on in any given photograph, then you may be a little bit more educated to yourself as to what you're actually painting because of the photo reference you're using. Now, let's dive in and start looking at some of our examples. Okay, let's take a look and see what we have in our first set of images. Now, this is going to be just 3 photographs of the exact same statue, but in completely different lighting situations. And one thing I want you to note is what's going on behind the statue. When you look at this one, there is some sunlight hitting back in here. Now, where the shadows are, it's going pure black. That's because I'm exposing for the sunlit area, and because there is such a difference in the lighting through across the picture, then you have to expose for one or the other, either the lights or the darks. And if I'm exposing for the lights, then my darks are going to actually go pure black. Now, if I wanted to use this as a reference, then I would not know what's going on back here, how these stones are shaped, depending on what's going on. So for that reason, I'm right now lacking information for me to paint it. But now, if I go on to the next one, then you could see that again, because of the lighting, this is a completely different lighting situation now compared to the last one. Here's one, here's the next one, and then now you can see some detail behind the statue again because of the direct sunlight right behind you is pretty much straight on sun, but then this is still black up in here, and then my final image would be actually the one I would use, but then now the whole entire area is black. And so for that reason, if you want to make that values of dark, cool colors, that's fine. That's up to you. But for one reason or another, if you need to fill this in and know what's going on with this, then you may either have to take multiple pictures of multiple exposures and let your lights wash out only to properly expose this, or also combine images if you have the ability to do an HDR, and we will get into that next. Okay, I will close this one down and open up my first image, and this is a 5 image, 5 exposure of the exact same thing, tripod mounted, and I want you to note how much difference there is. Now, this one is to expose for the rocks in the foreground. It is actually 2 2/3 overexposed compared to what it should have been shot at. Now, the next one is 1 2/3 overexposed, and then the next one is right on. Now, this is what this picture would look like if it's properly exposed according to my camera. Now this is all black and dark in here. If I try to use this as a reference, I would have no idea what's going on in here, whether it's trees, rocks, or something in between. Now the next one, now notice also the color of my sky as I keep going darker. Now the next one is under 1 2/3, and then the final image is underexposed by 2 2/3, which is a big difference compared to our very first one. But now if I take all of these images and then combine them into one, I will get this image. And now I have color across my sky and my horizon, and then I have a somewhat properly exposed foreground. But then also keep in mind my rocks are a little wee bit brighter than the trees, only because they are a more reflective, brighter color surface. And then obviously the water here is really reflecting the sky, so I have no problem there of capturing that properly exposed color compared to anything else. But now again, because of the way this is, the 5 exposure is actually what I am showing now, and it is a combination of all 5 pictures combined into one. And what you're actually doing is you're taking the properly exposed areas out of each photograph and putting them all together. Now, with that said, here is one image right here, that this one is a little wee bit different. This one is kind of properly exposed, but just to show you what the surface areas or surface colors could do to an image, you can see that the trees are all black, and they are all definitely silhouetted and not properly exposed. But because there is a ton of white frost over everything, it is really reflecting the light back up. So in other words, this is just a single shot, not bracketed, but because of what I was photographing, the exposure came out half decent. So depending on what you're photographing and how you're photographing it, and whether it's the lighting situation itself, could have a very big difference as to how your exposure will come out. Let's move on to the next set. Okay, I will close this one out and close this set down and open up a new set. And this is going to be roughly the same thing, but this one's a little bit more tricky. And the reason why is we will open it up. This is a night scene of Pittsburgh, but what's going on here is you have a lot of lights coming right at you, but you're also looking at the reflections. If we look at the reflections, we have orange and green lights in the background, but they're reflecting as pure white. And the reason why is because they're overexposed. So what I want to do is make a 3-image HDR just to show you the difference, that if I go to my proper exposed, now this is the overexposed here, if I go to my proper exposed according to the camera, I'm getting a little bit better. I could still see the tops of the buildings, but the reflections are still pure white, even though they are green and orange actual types of street lights or just night lighting, what have you. Now, with that in mind, if I go to the underexposed, now this is completely different type of lighting reflections, but now my buildings, I lost the top of my buildings, I lost a lot of detail in the foreground. So now, even though the way underexposed shot is showing nice colors for the reflections, it's too dark for everything else. So now if I combine those, I will get this. And then what will happen here is now I got good color reflections. I could still see the tops of my buildings. The twilight is just starting to come in. This is its sunrise. So this is a very low light situation, which is a very tough exposure, photographically speaking. But then for us to paint it, we could paint any type of light source we want in any given painting. But now if we start to go to, if I try to over adjust colors, and if I start with too dark of a picture and then try to over adjust, what's going to happen is my colors and quality are going to suffer. My blacks down here are starting to turn greenish, and that would not be very accurate either. That you could see that I'm getting a lot of noise. This is unretouched, just to show you the raw pictures. It's starting to turn green, and I'm getting quite a bit of noise in the actual photo. So that would be from actually trying to pretty much retouch up or correct the exposure too much, that I'm start getting all types of artifacts and inaccurate colors of what I would want to paint from. Now, let's go on to the next set and discuss black and white options. Okay, I will close this one down and then close this set, open up my next set. Now in black and white, this is going to be a little bit interesting because you could also consider this when you're drawing. If you do have overexposed, especially overexposed images, then you may want to consider black and white, whether it be graphite, charcoal, because with black and white, you can't have overexposed colors. Just for example, now one actual example would be this image is photographed just like it is. These lobster trap buoys are fluorescent yellow, just so they're easily spotted floating in the water. But if you do not want to actually work with those kind of colors, or even just make it more of a, how would you say, either natural photograph for yourself or actually something to paint from, then if you change it into a more or less black and white, or even a sepia tone for that matter, then you're going to have a completely different effect or end result when it comes to your finished art piece, or even your photograph for that matter. Now, with black and whites, one thing that really makes a nice black and white is a lot of contrast. And this one is the same thing. I have a backlit clouds here. This was very tough. This was also a 5 image exposure HDR. But one thing that's really helping out with the contrast is I have a lot of frost on all the foreground goldenrods and grass and rocks and what have you also. And that is giving a ton of contrast to the image itself. So if I would go to make that into a black and white, then it would make a very interesting black and white actually also to draw from. Because one thing that would make a nice black and white, or a watercolor for that matter, would be a lot of contrast and then over exaggerate the lighting conditions. Now, also the same thing, to go one step further, this is even a cemetery shot, but what I wanted to do was take this patch of white out. It really bothered me, just as an example of what could be done. So then what I did was I turned this into that. I took that patch of white out, but then I also put a very subtle, darker vignette around it, just to actually pull the attention into it. But then this is the reason why I want to show you these photographs, because a lot of these photographs were either cleaned up, fixed up, or more importantly, shot as exactly how I wanted to paint them. So a lot of my photographs are ready to go, because when I was out in the field looking for something to paint, I seen exactly what I wanted and then photographed some images just like I want to paint them. Otherwise, I may combine multiple images to paint from, where I may use different lenses for the images that I cannot get that type of picture with just one lens. We will also go over that here in a little bit. But now the same thing, if a black and white, if I look at this image, and it is a black and white, it has a very intense light source coming right at you. Notice how everything is silhouetted black, and then also the white, and then just shades of gray. This would be a very tough exposure in color. But in black and white, it's somewhat acceptable, and there's a lot of detail in all the roots and the ground, and even in the leaves and trees in the background. But now if I want to actually take an overexposed part of the city, then this is actually where I can just turn it into a sepia tone. And even though it's a black and white, overexposed is a little bit more acceptable, as a black and white than it would be at color, because again, you don't have no color washing out. Let's go on to the perspective of ultra wides that is very important, and that is our next set. Okay, let me close these down, and we will actually turn this group off, and we'll open up our next group. And this one is a little bit interesting. This may give you something to think about as an artist. Now, the reason why I say that is if I turn this first one on, this is a 16mm shot, and this is a pretty good lens. It's a Canon 16-35 Mark III, which is arguably one of their best lenses they make. It is very distortion free, but perspective distortion is something completely different. Now, you may hear terms like rectilinear lens and what have you. Just about most of them are that. But that is from barrel distortion, pincushion distortion, or a combination of both of them would be complex distortion. Perspective distortion is completely different. Now, what this is what I need to do is turn on my guidelines, and as long as I keep my horizon line in dead center, nothing is distorted. But the problem is that is pretty boring actual composition, especially when it comes to photography. Now, if we photograph images like this just for references, then we could take bits and pieces out of these types of photographs, whatever we want, and nothing will be distorted as long as you keep your horizon line in dead center. But now if I don't, then this is what I will get. I'm going to turn these down, and I'll turn this one on. Now if I put my horizon line low, then my trees are going to start to converge towards the top. And that is only because I'm getting a strong feeling of looking up. Now, in reverse, if I look down and then put my horizon line up high, then now my trees are going to converge towards the center. Just the exact opposite of this photo. Here they're converging to the top, and then in this photo, they're converging to the center. And the reason why is once I start getting an exaggerated perspective like that, you have to really take note of then what you're also drawing or painting, and whether the actual lines of the objects are accurate or not. And what I mean by that is if I turn on this one, here is two bridge piers. It is actually a harmless looking photo, but now look what's going on. And this is something really to think about, that I know from experience these bridge piers are perfectly plumb. That's the way these bridges were made. So all the weight is going straight down. But what happens is that if I put on the guides for this, they are actually converging towards the front of the actual photograph. Even this little barge tie-up right here is actually also on an angle. But what is really giving you something to think about is, yes, these piers are on an angle, but look at the reflections. They're also converging towards the center. So if you have an object leaning out this way, then the reflection should go this way. But it's not. It's actually converging with the pier. So that is actually kind of a double whammy, so to speak, that not only are the piers on an angle, but the reflections are at exactly the opposite wrong angle. Now, if I turn these down and put this one up, here's an interesting shot of the same bridge. Now, because this pier is closer to the center of the photo, just like I showed the very first trees, then what happens is because the vertical lines are near the center or the horizontal lines are near the center, then this pier is pretty much straight up and down, but this pier over here, because it's off the center of the image, is on an angle. Here's straight up and down right here. This is on an angle, and then even this big cement block right here is on an angle also, because it's closer away from the center. And then also this line, I should say, is very close to center, so it's kind of straight up and down. But then the other side of the block is converging down. Now, with that said, here is the next one This one will give you something to think about also. Now, when I'm photographing with this 16 millimeter, very seldom I have to be careful when I use these photographs for references. If not, I have to definitely make sure what's going on in the photo. This is the reflection off of the lighthouse of Assateague, Virginia, and you could see that it's on an angle. These are all unretouched photos so far. But then the same thing with this nest on a pole. This is for an osprey. The pole is leaning out only because of the perspective of the lens, but then obviously the same thing as the bridge piers, that the reflection, instead of it going out, it's going converging towards the center also. So here's the something to think about also. Because of a shot like this particular lens shoots at about an angle of 97 degrees. That is more than a right angle. So if you think about this, if I look at this particular lighthouse and its reflection, and it's going to be reflecting right back at me. Now, if I'm standing in the same place and then turn approximately 75 degrees and look at this pole, it will be reflecting right back at me. But now, in a painting, these actual reflections are usually considered accurate if they are parallel to the side of the image. But would that be correct? Because when you turn and look at something, it's going to be reflecting right back at you. And then turn this way and look at the nesting pole, it will be reflecting right back at you. But unfortunately, when you see them both in the same picture of a wide angle, they are both converging towards the center of where the camera actually is. Now that would be something to think about. But now this is actually shot at a 35 millimeter. So if I put my guidelines on this one, since it's closer to normal lens, which is about 50 millimeter, and that is what the human eye sees, about a 46, 47 degree angle, then this is considered normal, hence why they call it a normal lens. Then the bridge piers are nice and straight up and down, and the reflections are nice and straight up and down also. That's only because this particular picture was shot at about a 35 millimeter setting versus the other one shot at a 16 millimeter. Now, with that to think about, let's go on to our next set, which is depth of field, more considerations of actually what would be considered the limitations of a camera and lens. Okay, let me close these down and turn off this group, and we'll open up our depth of field. Now this is kind of interesting also. Now this right here is a shoveler, and it is a stopped action because this is about 1/2500th of a second. Even though his wings are going pretty good, it stopped them perfectly, which is nice. You get a ton of detail and what the actual duck is doing. But now keep in mind, because it's a fairly wide open aperture, in other words, I'm leaving a lot of light into the camera, then about right in here down is already out of focus, and then from about right in here up is out of focus, and it even gets worse as it goes back. So photographically, I actually use a crop method, which now I turned it on, and what I did was matched it up perfectly, so you can't see one against the other. But then if I turn this one off, this is what I would crop it down to, because I'm not really missing anything when I crop that out anyway. That would be photographically. But now artistically, this is where when I hear some folks say that I don't like to paint detailed because we already have cameras and you could already take a picture, that would be less than accurate. Only because I understand the limitations of the camera, and when I would paint this, I would paint the water obviously in focus the whole way out. Now, if you want to paint it exactly like a camera would portray it, that's up to you. Then this little band of about not even 2 feet wide would be in focus. But then what would be considered the depth of field would be 1/3 in front and 2/3 behind of what your focus point would be. Then that's what would be pretty much in focus at that particular f-stop setting. Now, with this in mind, then what I would do is crop it down to this photographically, because I'm not really missing too much. It's all out of focus water. But then artistically, then I would only take this duck out of this picture and use another water photograph that would be all in focus to get the detail of the waves and reflections I want. But then if I start combining pictures, then I got to understand whether it be the clarity of the water, the type of the sky, the reflection, movement of the water. That all has to be fit together when you start putting pieces of pictures together. Now, this is going to be our next problem, and that is the same thing. When I actually took a photograph of these flying geese, I have a whole sequence of these, but if I zoom in, even just to show you, that you can see this one is fairly sharp and this one is already out of focus. And that's only because of the fact that this one is only a foot or two behind this front one up here. So this one right here is already out of the depth of field because I'm actually shooting this with a 400-2.8 and a 1.4x converter, which gives me about a 560 millimeter shot. But then keep in mind, because I'm shooting at a very fast aperture, which in some cases are 2.8, just to stop the action, then my depth of field is very limited. So point being is, again, if I would want to paint a flock of birds, I could easily pull birds out of different photos and combine them, which in this case I did photographically, and that would be this one right here. What I did was took out 5 different birds from 5 different photos. They're all sharp. They're all under pretty much the same lighting, and I positioned them in just a way that then now I have 5 sharp birds in the same photo, which photographically would be borderline impossible to do, only because of just the proof we had right before this, and that is this one is already soft focus, even though it's only a couple of feet behind this one. So for that reason, once you start getting more birds and then even another bird behind this one, it would even be more out of focus than the second one. So for that reason, painting from photographs could give you a completely different effect of what a camera could do. And that is only because, again, the limitations of exposure and depth of field of a camera. Let's go on to our next set. Okay, let me close this one down, and I will close this set and open up our next group. And this is focus stack? No. And the reason why I did that, there is such a thing as an exposure stack. There's also a focus stack. But then this particular one, I would actually call a shutter speed stack. And this may even be new to some seasoned photographers out there. And the reason why I say that is this is something I did freehand. And what I am talking about is this particular shot right here. We'll open up with this one. This would be the original shot as is with no HDR or anything. So keep in mind, without HDR, your colors are going to be suffering because I'm trying to expose for the water. And if I do, then everything else is going to go dark. So now with that in mind, I also want to keep everything from the furthest point in the photo to the closest point in the photo all in sharp focus. This was shot at f/22, and what happens though is it causes me to shoot at low shutter speeds. I always shoot at ISO 50 or 100 just to get the best quality I can photographically. But now here's the problem. Because this is a slower shutter speed, it's allowing my whites and reflections of the sky to keep on registering, and everything is kind of a blur. And then also the main waterfall is definitely a blur because it's moving water that's being recorded as it's moving. So now if I want to shoot this pool in a faster shutter speed, but then it's going to be limited depth of field, but then all I need is just this pool from here down to here, then that could be done with a faster shutter speed. So now if I take that shot and combine it with this shot, this is what I would get. Now I have detail and more actual reflections of pine trees and it's just everything else that's going on. But keep in mind, it's still something that I may even consider changing, only because I now still have my soft water coming down off the waterfall. So if I take another shot of just it, then this is what I get. But now my pool is suffering again. So if I take a different shot of a pool and then combine it with this, then everything put together would be this right here. And this is the final image I came up with. It is actually has some nice reflections and detail in the actual pool reflection. And then plus, because the white is not registering over time, I can actually see the carved out granite, and then even just a subtle hint of the actual sun trying to pierce through the clouds, where it was a bigger blur before. And then now, of course, my actual waterfall itself is frozen in time, which is something I couldn't do. But the last shot I took was just of the waterfall with a faster shutter speed, not worrying about whether the trees went out of focus or the actual foreground went out of focus, because the only thing I was interested in was this band right through here, and that was it. Now, when I combined all those shots, this is what I get, but this is a very difficult shot, which would literally be impossible to get with just one shot. And then now, obviously, though, this is blurs that you may not want, but now if you do want a blur that would show action, then this is what I would get. And it's a shot such as this. This one was shot right at sunset. This is Portland Head Light in Maine, but then this is a quarter of a second shutter speed, and this is what it'll do to the waves that will definitely kind of register as a blur, but it definitely shows motion. And the same thing with these. This is Lake Michigan with the same thing. The clouds are nice and sharp, but the water is moving too quick for the shutter speed I was using, so it comes out as a blur. And then the same with this duck, that I used 1/60th of a second to photograph this duck, which was fast enough to keep the bird and its body nice and sharp, only because it wasn't moving that much at all. But as you could see, the wingtips, the further away you get from the body, the faster the wingtip is moving, and the more of a blur till it almost completely disappears and is completely transparent, that the wings go at that shutter speed. When I photographed the snow geese a while back, I was shooting them at 2500th of a second. This is only 1/60th. So depending on whether you want your wingtips perfectly stopped, or for that matter, any moving object perfectly stopped, then it may depend on how fast it's moving and how far it's moving at that speed. Now, let's go to the next set. It's just a couple of retouched photos just to show you the difference of what a retouch can make. Okay, let me close this one out, and we will close this stack and open up the next one. Now, this one has a couple of different examples in it, and they're all just grouped together, each example. And I'll go to the first one. This would just be more or less like color and mood, just a basic retouch that may be able to improve. Or, in other words, some of these retouches is how I would adjust a photograph. But at the same time, if I would use this as a reference, then I would make that change on a painting. So don't let the retouch scare you from being a photograph. It's also something I would do in a painting as to a change or a correction I would make compared to the photograph and how I would paint it. So in other words, this bright red sweatshirt, now this gentleman obviously wanted to be seen in very limited visibility conditions. This was shot at Presque Isle State Park in Erie, Pennsylvania. So this is a regular road, and he wanted to be seen, so I'm sure that's probably why he was wearing the red. But at the same time, it creates a little bit of a conflict with the actual atmosphere itself. So now if I would take that red and tone it down some, and then even add my snow back in, that what I did was actually then add a little wee bit of snow back in. Now this is what I personally would go with as a finished photograph, or make those adjustments on a painting if I was painting this. Then if I wanted to, I could put a little wee bit more detail in the foreground, but these are just actually card tracks here, nothing special there. But just as far as the atmosphere goes, these are the changes I would make. Now, oddly enough, it's interesting that what I did, and I will do this in further demos, but in the original photograph, all I did was take my selection tool brush with a color selector and then just pulled all that red out and selected that just red area, and then went back in and actually changed the color with my Prussian blues and my browns and just toned it down some. Now let's go on to the next set, and that is the water drops, and I'll show you an interesting part about this. This is actually the original photo, and what I'll do is I'll enlarge it even, but then these are what I put on freehand, and this is a photograph that would be very difficult to photograph. And what I mean by that is this drop is just getting ready to let go, and to catch timing like that with a photograph, you'd need several tries. I know I would anyway. But because I freehanded these drops on, what I did was place them in darker areas right here and right here, just so the drop could easily be seen up against the dark background. If I would have put them over here or around in here somewhere, then they would have blended in too much with the lighter color leaves, and you wouldn't even be able to see the drop as quick and as nice as you can now. But again, with this particular photograph, it would be difficult for me to paint from this, only because I know that particular drop would be very difficult to catch as a photograph. So again, it's not as it appears. Now I'll turn these off. We'll go on to the next one. And this is a very basic, simple one. This is a cardinal, but what this is a cardinal sitting on a broken branch, and this white could easily conflict with the bird itself. Now for me, this is an eye grabber down here. But what I did was I cut out a section of this over here, this part of the branch, and then flopped it and put it on top of this, and this is what I got. And now, because of the white being gone, my attention just goes back to the cardinal, and that's it. So for that reason, this is eliminated, but then I also kept the same lighting as up here, since I only flopped it horizontally. The lit part of the branch stays on top, and if you look real close, this shape right here is this shape right here in reverse. So all I did was take a section of this, put it over here, and then just kind of slowly feathered in into what's already there. But what it did was it did cover up my white hot spot and put the emphasis back on the bird. Let's go to our next one. And that would be adding fog. And this is just, I will put up a tag of this one, how I did it from start to finish. It's a little bit of an elaborate one. It's in one of the Rebel 4 tracing layer series images. But it's interesting that with fog, it does happen in stages. In other words, way back in here would be much heavier fog compared to this wharf right here, and then right down in here the foreground water would have very little fog at all, because this is where you're standing, and the visibility would be fairly easy to see. So when I added it manually and painted it in, this is what I got. So I took a fairly clear day, overcast, and put fog into it. But if you want to see again how that was done, we'll put the tag up to show you that particular demo. Let's move on to the next ones, and that would be just ways of improving any given photo, and especially of some of the ones I picked out of the demos I'm going to have coming up. Okay, let me close these two out, and I will close this big group and open up this one. And this one is a photo I got coming up. I'm going to paint this, and again, these are all my own photos, and a lot of these, especially the ones we're going to go over right now, are all photos that I shot specifically to paint, but then also I shot them as is, ready to paint. When I was focusing and setting up the shot and framing it, I picked out exactly what I wanted to paint. So the image is pretty much almost my painting itself as is. Now, what I would change in this particular photo is I had no choice as to shoot it as is with somebody's wall and building and everything. But what I would do is take this out back here, this half pot, and this right here, bench, and some of these, even this, if I take this out, then I obviously have to take these vines out too, coming from this pot. And then I would leave this tree right here and this pot just by itself, so it'd be nice and open and easy to see. And then everything else I would pretty much leave as is. Now, moving on to the next one. This one's kind of interesting, only because this is the Alpine Meadow of West Virginia. I'm going to do this one as a demo also of a painting coming up. But one thing is interesting is because I actually exposed for the sky, but I was there and kind of had a good idea what was going on. The hint of what I would say is right here in the reflection. And that is, reflections are always darker than anything else of water in anything else of what's in the photo. So for that reason, I could see the bottoms of gray clouds, the white parts of the clouds, and then hints of blue sky in the reflection. But if I look at my sky, it's all pure white the whole way across. So what I have to do is make clouds and break them up and put hints of blue skies here and there as just like a patchy, cloudy day, so the sky will actually match my reflection. Either that, or I would have to do it the other way around. If I make it an even overcast gray day, then I can't put all that detail and all that texture in my reflection. One or the other. Let's move on to the next one. Now this one's interesting. This is poison ivy, and it is up against a red barn. But what thing about this image that grabbed my eye is it's all red against red with little patches of yellow. So even though red is as bold as it is, this yellow leaf right here, I think I would make it a little wee bit bigger just to make sure it becomes the center of focus of attention. And then that way I may make splashes of yellows here and there all over to carry you throughout the painting of reds. So what I would have is pretty much an all red painting with just splashes of yellow here and there, and then one big yellow splotch right down here in the lower rule of thirds. Now the last one, same thing here, and this is getting back to the same thing as the depth of field. I'm going to paint this one, but because it's a very low lighting day, two things happened. I had to open it up just to get a decent exposure because of a low light situation, which then the eye went dark, and even though the eye is brown and has some nice detail in it, I would not want to make just a black eye, only because that is what I would consider shark eyes, which then when something has black eyes, it kind of looks dead. So I would want to put some brown in color into that eye artificially, not just exactly like the photograph is. And then also, because it's such a wide open shot of a f-stop, that I am already losing a good bit of focus in my goldenrod and even in the tail. Now keep in mind, this is only about a couple of inches of what's considered in focus, only because this bird was photographed out of a blind, and it's probably only about anywhere from 7 to 8 feet away from me. So for that reason, you could see where the focus band is, which is right through here. And then once you start getting back to the tail, and then it's already out of focus, or any of the goldenrod leaves that are back even further, they're even softer yet. And then even some of the ones that are in the foreground that are even coming at you or going away from you, they may also be out of that plane of focus. So with that in mind, I would put everything in focus and change that from the original photograph. Now let's move on to just some ideas and suggestions of photographs or something to photograph while you're out and about of something that you may want to paint from. Okay, let me close this one down. And I'm going to close this group, and then I'll open up the abstracts. And this, again, if you want abstract ideas for all the abstract artists out there, nature actually offers quite a few ideas that you can do. This is ice very close up with just snow on it, and the way it's refracting the colored stones underneath in the water is rather interesting. And again, this is kind of photographed just as is, but the ice will reflect a lot of the sky. And the next one would be actually that boat I put the fog in. These are the very colorful fluorescent buoys, markers that are on the side of it. This is just a reflection in the water as to what the subject matter is, but because it's in a specific type of water moving a specific way, it makes some very interesting shapes and color patterns. Now, along the same lines with that one is this one, and this one is crystal clear water refracting the colorful stones at the bottom of Lake Superior, which is very interesting. And then you have obviously the hint of the water reflecting the skylight depending on the angle of the wave. And I will close that one out, open this one up. This one is rather interesting as far as an abstract subject matter goes. This is all the colors of the minerals leaching out of the cliffs along Lake Superior. It is called Pictured Rocks, and these are all natural. These are photographs that were taken as is. And again, just to elaborate on this one was photographed while it was wet, and that's why I'm getting my good colors. Back in my film days, you only had a couple of choices to photograph if you wanted saturated colors. You photographed usually after a rain, which gave you much better colors, but then also you may have chosen a Kodachrome if you wanted better oranges and reds, and you may have chosen an Ektachrome if you want better blues and greens. That was the only choices you had back then. Now you could oversaturate all you want with any given digital photograph software. Now the last one is just the same thing along the lines of Pittsburgh, and is just a reflection of the bridge. And this one is a little bit more of a challenge to get as far as a photograph goes, only because I wanted it in focus from top to bottom, and it's moving, so I have to use a faster shutter speed, but I still have to keep the aperture closed down enough that it'll keep everything in focus. And that's all what would be considered working with, even to a certain extent, beyond infinity of any specific lens. Then that way you will know that everything is in focus from your focus point on. That is a little bit more of the photographic side, which is something we don't need to get into right now. Let's move on to the final thoughts, and that will be it. Okay, let's move on to our final images. I'll close this one down. We're just about done here, and I'll close this group and open up the last one. And this is just some ideas. Now, again, as I said about coloring, this is interesting in the sense that this right here is a fairly colorful sunrise. But here's the thing, concentrate on where that red block is. And now if I isolate that red block, any given shot, this was photographed at about 50 millimeters. So here's my point. Photographically, the sun would be about 1/40th, rough example of how much the picture is wide, as this is a 12 by 8 image, and the actual sun by proportion to that size shot at a normal lens would be about 1/40th of the width of the image. That is pretty much what you would see at the angle your human eye would look at. And so for that reason, you could pretty much tell when you look at somebody's photograph of what angle of lens they used, only because the millimeter of the lens makes all the difference as to how big the sun will be. When you take the photograph, the sun is always going to be the same size it is, but depending on what lens you use, will exaggerate or under-exaggerate the size. So for that reason, this is fairly colorful, but if I isolate just this inside the red box, this is what I get. a very colorful image. I am not over exaggerating colors. I'm just cropping down more in on the colors. And for that reason, this is a little wee bit different time of day only because the bird's there now. And in the previous one, it was not. So for that reason, this one I kept only because this is a little wee bit later in the sunrise. And this is actually a sun pillar now of what's going on. But because of how much color it is, it's already starting to fade. But compared to this, there is a ton of color there when the sun is just coming up. But if you notice, this sun would be wider than 1/40th of the image. It would be probably closer to 1/20th, only because of the fact that this is shot at 100 millimeter versus actually 50. Now, to give you another example of that, then we could go to this one. Now, this one was shot at about 16 millimeter, and it is a very wide angle shot. You could already see that you're starting to go up into the blackness of space here. This is, I think, either Mercury or Venus, and then this is either the North Star or one or the other. That I'm not sure of, don't quote me on that, but those are as they were that day. That is not retouched, that's all I'm saying. But now look at the hard orange band across the horizon line. But now if I zero in on just that, then this is what I would get. Right here. And if I turn this one off, then this is what I would get compared to the previous picture, which is right here. There we go. Then this is showing very little color compared to, how would you say, the percentage of the photo itself. Where if I turn this one off and turn the other one on, when I go into just the horizon line, now I'm getting nothing but color, and that could look exaggerated, artificially produced, but it's not. I'm just zooming in on just the color. Now I'll close this one out, and then when it comes to other photos you may want to be interested in, consider like this one would be a unique angle. And when these gentlemen were crossing up, I like to photograph motocross races and drag races, that when these guys were crossing up, they were actually going just about sideways in the air. But because I positioned myself to photograph that, it almost looks like I'm actually directly under them, but I'm not. They're just literally sideways in the air, crossed up before they land. For as far as scenery goes, one of the best times to photograph is right at twilight, only because you have enough light. It's a nice even lighting situation, that you have enough light to register buildings and everything else that's going on, but then it's also dark enough that your lights will also register. And being that the fact that I really do like to photograph in wet conditions, even for all of my photo references to paint from, then if this was a dry street, I would have no light reflections, no nothing. It would just be a fairly bland image, and then that would be it. But because everything's wet, and it's even during a drizzle at that time, you can see folks are still using umbrellas at that time. That's what's giving you the sparkles off the light. It's actually the refraction of the water droplets. And then also the reflection off the streets provide much more interest than just a dry street would have been. Color unity, that would be just a suggestion of even like composition. The same colors that are in the rocks and in the water is in the leaves and in this stone bridge. I have a lot of the same colors that are even dripping down, and also just what would be the iron oxide in the different rocks and in the bridge itself. Color unity, it really helps out tying different objects together. Blocking corners compositionally, again, composition is very subjective, but what I try to do is include as many of these elements in each and every photo or painting that I do, and then that way blocking corners, this one is blocked right here. This one is blocked in here because of the heavier branches ending right in there. And then these steps down here block this one, and this green blocks this one. So what it does is creates kind of an elliptical movement that kind of eliminates the corners, so to speak. That if there's really not too much going on in a corner or what have you, then you'll keep an elliptical movement throughout the image. Now, the crashing waves here I have coming up next. Just one last thought of also the size of these waves were huge, but without anything there, it's nothing to actually show up against until I actually add people, which they came later and humored me. And this wall here is just where water was crashing. It just went straight up and even back out into the ocean. So they were very safe where they were. They got hit with a little bit of overspray every now and then, but the major part of the wave crashing stayed right where it's at here. But with people in the picture, could definitely now show you the scale of the waves that were crashing that day. And in the very end, a camera is actually just a tool to get references. It will definitely not replace a freehand painting done in a thoughtful way. So for that reason, when you use a fast shutter speed, it can freeze things that you definitely may not see with the human eye. This is a actual nitromethane car taken off. This is a split second after the green light, and this is the reason why they have their rims completely bolted down to the tire, because there is so much torque from those engines. They would probably spin the rims right inside the tires and not go anywhere. But with that said, the way this tire is just totally crumbling under the pressure of the torque of that engine is phenomenal. But without a camera, you may never see something like that. Now, I hope all these different ideas and suggestions of photo references, how to get better ones, how to use the ones you may use, will help you in one way or another. And I may refer back to this particular demo as I do my future paintings, just to give you a rough idea of why I use my photo references the way I do and how I evolved in the type of paintings I do. So again, as I always say, until I see you out in the field or back at the studio, thanks for watching.